The golden light spilled over the kitchen, bathing it in a gentle honey hue. That night, Brooklyn was so quiet, it felt like it had swallowed every sound. Only the soft dripping of water remained, and the heavy silence inside my heart, full of unspoken echoes. I stood there, washing dishes, my body slightly bent forward, hair falling loosely over my collar. The thin nightgown clung softly to my skin, a faint trace of sweat spreading along my spine. One strap slid carelessly off my left shoulder. Not intentional, but my husband's indifference had made me forget how to care about being graceful anymore. I turned, slowly, and my eyes met his. Lucas, my husband's friend. He stood so close. I could feel his breath brushing against my face like a warm gust of wind. He said nothing, but his eyes, deep and clouded, were veiled with long-suppressed desires that had never been named. Lucas stepped just half a breath closer, enough for his chest to graze mine. I couldn't step back. I couldn't even stand still. His hand pressed against the countertop, trapping us in a narrow, private space, too tight for escape, too intense to breathe. She felt caught between heat and a flood of tangled thoughts. The fragile fabric of her gown couldn't hide the way her nipples had hardened, rising with each pulse of her heartbeat. She panicked at her own reaction. Her panties were damp now, not from water, but from that sharp, aching sensation between her thighs. Lucas leaned in, his breath crawling along her neck. Then he whispered, voice low and raspy, "Emma, do you even know how beautiful you are when you don't belong to anyone?" His words pierced her mind like an arrow, direct, forbidden, and impossibly raw. He didn't kiss her, didn't touch her again. But Emma felt completely stripped by nothing but his voice. Her body trembled. Her legs slightly curled in. Her heart raced out of rhythm. A part of her wanted to run. Another part was drowning in the dangerous thrill of this unspoken sin. If he touches me, just a little, my panties will be soaked. The thought screamed in her mind, and she hated herself for it. Every breath he took seemed to slither across her skin, making her body tense, tighter, like it was about to snap. Lucas remained silent, but his eyes burned through every defense she had left. Emma tilted her head slightly, catching the deep, musky scent rising from his collar. She felt herself drifting into a world where right and wrong no longer existed. Her nipples ached beneath the damp fabric, too hard for too long. Her knees nearly gave out, and her hand instinctively grabbed the counter to keep from falling. In that cramped kitchen space, Emma finally understood. Sometimes silence could make a woman wetter than any touch ever could. New bam. Ken mi chuan huatem jin hap truk tiep vao fan voice narration text, min se format lai huan hao chatung juan jok, catch swang dong hip to. Huak stach no tung fan theo juan long. Gep voice AI. Ban muan min lamsan ban huan chin dang voice script luon kong. Haikon muan tiep noi dung juan sao. Lucas didn't touch her anymore, but his eyes were fixed on her body as if they were looking through the thin fabric. Emma felt her skin burning, even though there was no fire nearby. She wondered, could that gaze replace a caress? The atmosphere was stifling, filled with lust, but still numbingly silent. And it was that silence that truly made her heart panic, as if trapped in a soft but dangerous trance. She swallowed softly. A small action, but it clearly reflected her confusion. Lucas was still standing there, like a storm about to hit. His chest rose and fell steadily, the scent of his masculine flesh mixed with the light orange scent of her swimsuit. His eyes never left the hollow of her neck, where the sweat rolled down slowly. Emma unconsciously squeezed her thighs lightly. When the wet feeling still hadn't disappeared, she didn't know. Was it guilt or a rising female instinct? You still haven't answered. His voice was low and deep. Have you ever thought of me? The question was like a knife cutting her mind in two. Yes, sometimes. But that was something she had hidden away, buried deep within her. Now the question revealed everything. Emma didn't answer, just turned away. But her hand gently touched the cold stone of the stove, as if to keep herself awake. Under the fabric, her breasts were painfully hard, and she knew her silence was the clearest confession. Lucas moved closer, not touching, just letting his breath lightly fan her ear. Is your heart beating fast? Because of fear or because of desire? The question made Emma's whole body break out in goosebumps. No one could understand better than her at that moment. The line between desire and wrong, as thin as a hair, and she was walking on it with trembling legs. At that moment, all principles were pushed back. Only the erratic beating in her chest remained. In that confusion, she was no longer sure what was right. She only knew. Her panties were still, slowly absorbing the truth she dared not admit. AI. Ban mon min lam san ban hoan chin dang voice script luon kong. Hai kon mon tiep noi dung joan sao. The kitchen suddenly felt cramped. Not because of the distance, but because the air between them was thick, boiling like a pot of water about to overflow. Lucas took a small step back, but his eyes were still locked on Emma, as if he was suggesting opening a door that no one had dared to enter for a long time. She turned her face away, but her chest was still breathing heavily. Under the thin layer of her shirt, her two nipples had already stood up as a natural reflex. Emma was confused, squeezing her hands on the kitchen counter, wondering, I am still his wife, but why am I like this? You don't need to say anything, Lucas whispered softly. Your body has already answered for you. That sentence was like a needle piercing deep into the long-buried void inside her. Emma's body was burning. She tried to step back, but her hips unconsciously bumped into his arm. A light touch, but made the thin fabric between her thighs even wetter. That humiliating truth made her face flush. Her legs trembled, as if they no longer belonged to her. In that moment, Emma saw herself no longer as a model wife, but as a woman who craved to be touched. Lucas did not kiss her. He did not touch her skin. But each word he uttered seemed to be peeling off layers of fabric in her mind. Do you? No, there are things people do not dare to do, but still imagine every night? Emma bit her lip lightly, her heart exploding. Every night lying next to her husband, she often imagined a different breath, a different pair of hands, a different gaze. Like this moment. Suddenly, she felt guilty not in her actions, but in the very fantasies she had secretly nurtured. Lucas stepped back, without saying anything more. But before leaving the kitchen, he left one last sentence. There are things you do not need to decide, because your body has long since chosen. Emma stood still, frozen in her own lingering breath. The sweat on her back was cold, but between her thighs, it was pitifully wet. Her hand unconsciously clenched the thin hem of her shirt. The feeling of embarrassment mixed with the lingering echo of desire made her heart surge. And in that moment, she knew. Something inside her had broken. Ban muon min lam san ban hoan chin dang voice script luon kong. Hai kon muon. Tiep noi dung joan sao. Emma stood in the kitchen, motionless. The sound of the door closing behind her was like an invisible ending, but it opened another door inside her. She gently raised her hand to her neck, where Lucas's breath was still warm like a trace, a fire that had not yet cooled. Her fingers slid down her chest, unconsciously touching her nipples that were already hard and erect. Pale pink, trembling. A stream of thoughts flowed back. Why does my body betray me before my heart? She wondered, and feared the answer. Walking back to the room, Emma saw her husband sleeping soundly on the sofa. The yellow light covered his face with a strangely peaceful look. Part of her wanted to rush over and hug him to dispel the torment in her heart. But her legs stood still, as if held back by the echoes of the kitchen. If he wakes up, will he still smell the scent of a man in my hair? She shivered slightly. Her hand touched the hem of her shirt. The feeling between her thighs was still moist and soft, like an unspoken confession. She stepped into the bathroom and turned on the water. But the cold water could not quench the heat that was simmering in every cell of her skin. Emma undressed and looked at herself in the mirror. Her full, rosy breasts, the red mark on her neck like an invisible mark. She reached down, gently stroked her thighs, feeling the shameless softness that had not yet subsided. Lucas never touched me, but he made me wetter than when we made love. The words echoed in her head like a verdict. The water still flowed. She let it flow over her skin, but her heart could not wash away the thoughts that had just sprouted. That night, Emma lay next to her husband, the man who had been with her for so many years, but her heart felt like it was being pulled in another direction. Lucas did not need to touch. He only needed to stand behind her. But he made her feel like she was being seen through to the very end of her womanly instincts. And in that painful contradiction, Emma realized it wasn't that she had changed. It was just that she had just found the truest part of herself. Night fell. Emma lay on her side next to her husband, the moonlight through the thin curtains covering her smooth white skin with a faint blue color. His hand unconsciously wrapped around her waist, but she could no longer feel that familiar warmth. She closed her eyes, trying to reassure herself that this was still where she belonged. But in the darkness, there was only the sound of her heart beating suffocatingly, and the scent of Lucas's skin still faintly somewhere in her newly formed memories, but too clear to deny. Emma remembered Lucas's eyes, a quiet look, but as if there were hundreds of questions that had never been asked. Could it be? She had also wished that someone would look at her like that, not just as a wife, a mother, but as a woman full of desire that needed to be touched to the very end of her instincts. She found herself drifting between two shores. One side was love, the other was passion. But the choice sometimes did not come from reason, but from a very soft whisper echoing in her chest every night. In the middle of the night, Emma turned over and gently stepped out onto the balcony. The wind was cold, but her skin was still hot. She pulled out her phone, her hand shaking slightly when she saw the message. "Do you still remember the scent of tonight?" Lucas? Just one line, not suggestive, not dating, but enough to make her heart ache. A drop of water fell from the corner of her eye, not knowing if it was the wind blowing in or her own tears. Emma did not reply. She just placed her hand on her chest, where her heart was beating softly. Tonight, no one touched her, but all the feelings were still burning, like she had just gone through a silent pleasure. When she returned to bed, Emma looked at her husband, the man who had been by her side for so many years, and whispered in her mind, "You are still home." But maybe I accidentally opened the door for the wind to wander away. She knew no sin had happened, but what had not happened was 1,000 times more painful. Lucas had left, but what he left behind was a lasting shock in every breath she took. And on a peaceful night that seemed like any other night, Emma understood that there were times when infidelity came not from actions, but from the moment someone saw through the womanly side that we had never dared to face in our lives.